Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a black cat in graphite and more specifically how to draw black fur in graphite. Now before I get onto that, I do want to make sure that I've got the eyes right first. Now this is where the main emotion and expression stems from, so this here is really important. I first of all map in the shape of the eye and then I start building up my layers. Now layers is something that we're going to be focusing a lot on this tutorial. Now for here, on the outside section of the eye, the darkest part, you can see that I'm building up my layers gradually. I haven't just jumped straight in with my darkest pencil, something like a 9B, because I'm going to end up with an area that's flatter and a bit more two-dimensional. Now that's not quite so obvious when you're working on a section like that tiny narrow eyelid, but when we start layering the fur here, look at how I've not jumped into my darkest pencils. This here is really going to focus on that throughout this tutorial. Now to ensure that I don't put down that darkest pencil first, I am working a little bit more from light to dark. So my main aim here at my initial layers is I'm focusing on my pencil technique. So I've got my fur length, fur thickness and fur direction. In terms of that technique, this is something that I explain in depth thoroughly in the step-by-step version on Patreon. So if that's of interest, then I'll link my Patreon in the description below. There are no sections sped up or cut out, and I've got a voiceover while I'm drawing, so every single process is explained thoroughly. Now regarding the pencil technique here, the fur direction is so important. As I'm starting to build up the fur on the top of the eye, you can see here how it curves over towards the left side of the paper. That there and the way that it curves, the angle of those pencil strokes are going to help to build up the shape of the skull. So all of this is actually really important, especially if we're working with pet portraits. That drawing has to resemble that animal. If the fur direction is shifting slightly in our drawing, it is enough to change not only the expression, but the shape of that animal's face. So this is something that I do focus on right from that very first layer. As I then continue to build my layers, this is where I'm going back to focusing on my contrast. Now the contrast is the values that we're trying to replicate, so our lights and our darks. You can see that I'm going in with some darker pencils to reinforce some of those shadows, but then I'm also using my erasers to lift up some graphite and add in my highlights. Now in some cases I don't use an eraser in all areas. I can actually allow the whiter or lighter values of that graphite to show through. So if you've got a particularly bright highlight maybe in the eye, I would draw around that highlight to allow the white of the paper to show. Therefore I know that that highlight is as bright as I can possibly get it. Now of course with black fur you're probably not going to want your highlights as bright as that, so you will want some degree of graphite on the paper, and that's when you'd want to use your erasers to lift up some of that graphite and hint at those highlights. Now the erasers that I like to use, I've got three main ones. I've got a putty eraser, got a Tombow mono eraser or a battery eraser. Now depending on the type of technique and the effect that I'm going for will make me decide which eraser I need, and again this is something that I really do focus on in the Patreon tutorials. So here this side-by-side comparison is because I actually was going to do this portrait using a different paper, just experimenting with another brand, but I felt that during that process I wasn't able to get the same number of layers. Now this is something that I cover in my Patreon tutorial because the results that I found from this comparison were really interesting. As I continued to layer on this current project that I ended up sticking with, which was with my paper that I use normally for my graphite portraits, I was actually finding that I think it was the different graphite powder I used which was being more of a problem rather than the original paper that I had started with. So the results there were really interesting, and this is something that I'm going to continue to experiment with over the next few projects. Now what I ended up doing is actually creating my own graphite powder after this stage when I realised, is it the graphite powder, is it the paper? And I felt that the best way for me to judge this fairly was to change the graphite powder. Because I'm used to working on this paper for all of my graphite portraits, I know that this works for my techniques. So what I decided to do is create my own graphite powder, and I've got a video here on YouTube showing how to do that. I'll link that in the description below if that's of interest. This here is really where I did feel, do you know what, I think it might have been the graphite powder, and that's why I'm now not going to do a review based on this project on the new paper that I was going to use to start with, because I don't think it would have been fair. So I'm going to work on another project with the graphite powder that I know works for my techniques, and then I can give a really honest opinion on that second paper that I was hoping to use for future projects. Now, I am often asked about the paper that I use, and I'm not looking to change my paper at all. I love working on the Strathmore paper, which is my preference for my graphite portraits. But because I am a little bit of a worrier, I do want to make sure that I've got a backup option. Should anything happen, you know, maybe if I can't get hold of the Strathmore for any reason, that I do have a second paper choice that I can use. So as I continue to build up the cat's face, you can see how I am working in small, manageable chunks. Now, this is another question that I'm asked on social media, and why do I work this way compared to blocking in entire layers for the entire subject? Now, this is a good question, and the reason for me why I like to work like this and I break it up into small parts is because I know that I would have a tendency to either rush specific layers and I'd skip out on really important depth, or I would end up completely becoming overwhelmed by the subject that I'm drawing. So by breaking it up into small manageable chunks, I make sure that each section gets the amount of time that it needs. I make sure that I'm building up the amount of layers that's required, and I'm not ever becoming stressed. If you're spending more time looking at your reference photo thinking, oh, where should I start? I'm getting a little bit overwhelmed by the process. It's probably because we're working on too much of a larger area. Scale that down, work on 1 or 2 inches at a time, and then you'll find there that you'll work more productively throughout that portrait. So earlier on in this tutorial, I mentioned about pencil technique and how we need to adjust the pencil strokes in order to replicate the right fur texture. Well, this area on the cat's face is one of those areas where we need to pay very close attention to this technique. So the fur here is significantly shorter than anywhere else on the face. This will be the same with any cat. So we do want to be making sure that we're scaling down our pencil strokes to make sure that we're replicating the correct fur texture. I'm still focusing on building up my layers gradually. None of that has changed, but the pencil technique has. Now, the pencil technique and how I am able to get such fine details and the layering process is definitely one of those areas where I'm asked more frequent questions about that specific technique. So if you would like to see all of this in real time, then this and lots of other tutorials are available on my Patreon channel. I do also have a Patreon library, which is linked in the description below, and that has a complete list of all tutorials that are available on Patreon, and you get immediate access to all of those tutorials within the tier that you've subscribed to as soon as you join. Now, the great thing about Patreon is you can stay for as long as you like, or you can cancel at any time. It's really flexible. And if you've got any questions about that or anything art related, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now, as I've continued to build up the layers here and I'm getting more of the cat's face drawn in, you can really see how the contrast and values are playing such an important role in building up the three-dimensional shape of the face. My position and placement of those highlights and shadows are not random. Just like with the fur direction that I spoke about at the beginning of this tutorial, the placement of your highlights and shadows can also affect the shape of the face. So you'll have some highlights around the eyes, where the bridge of the nose is, the forehead, all of those main structures of the skull are going to catch the light and darks in a different way. So this here again is something that I really do want to make sure that I focus on. Now, for the body element of this portrait, it was really dark, and it's why I chose this reference photo for the Patreon tutorial. Now, I had a couple of requests from Patreon members asking if I could create a tutorial showing how to draw black fur, and that's the whole reason why I've decided to do this cat. But what I wanted to do is when I picked the reference photo, I wanted to have something where the fur was really dark so I could show how to tackle that. Now, my Patreon channel focuses on pet portraits and wildlife art, so if any of my Patreon members are looking to take on commissions of their own, maybe even do it as a full-time job, you know, I love what I do. If I can maybe have a wide range of tutorials of domestic pets, dog, cats and horses, then that is my end goal. I want to try and have as much variation there to help out with the pet portrait side of things as I can. So I wanted to have this tutorial where if a Patreon member has a reference photo to work from that's really dark, that they can use the tips and techniques that I share here into their own work and add more detail to that drawing if necessary. Because quite often when working with darker photographs, that detail is lacking. Now, one thing I can't stress enough is when I say dark photographs, I don't mean a lower quality so that the overall lighting is too dark. I just mean if the fur of that animal is really dark. Because quite often, like in this situation, the reference photo was beautiful, really well detailed, high quality, but the fur did look really dark. This here would not be a reason for me to turn down that portrait. It's just knowing how to use the pencils and how to layer that graphite in order to replicate that in our drawing. But low quality photographs is something that each artist is very unique in their decision on whether or not they take on that commission. As a general rule, if I cannot see fur detail, I won't accept that commission because it does just show in the finished portrait. It makes the drawing process far more stressful because we'll have to guess along the way, and that's just something that is not enjoyable. You know, we decide to do these portraits because we like creating art. Working from low quality photographs is a real headache. So the very last element that gets added are the whiskers. Now these are overlapping, they sit on top of everything else, all of the fur underneath. So for me, I do want to be making sure that they're the last element that I add. Now this here is a little bit daunting because I'm having to remove quite a lot of dark graphite in order to make these whiskers visible. But you can see here, through the right technique, it is achievable. So if you would like to see how I created this and other whiskers, then all of that is covered in the Patreon version. I do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below. I'm more than happy to help, and I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube in the next few days. As always, thank you so much for watching.